That's my center point of research as well, right? I mean, quantum entanglement is what, and hyper entanglement and so on and so forth. So entanglement, just for your viewers, I mean, I would say, let me just quickly define it. Basically, the idea that you have a certain correlation or connection of the property values of different elements, right? So for instance, if I were to have this table and another separate table, right? And there is a one-to-one correspondence between the tables as such, right? So if this is brown, that has to be brown. If this is black, that has to be black, and so on and so forth. And it remains in that superposition, right? All that those possibilities coexist, right? Till the point you measure it, right? Now, how do you measure it? If let's say I take this to Nashik, right, or to Kolkata, right, and I keep this in Delhi, right, and I measure the color of this, I observe it, then it will uniquely determine what the color of the other would be as well. At the same, determine, yeah, it would uniquely tell you exactly what the color should be like, right? However, people often say that there is a misconception that means that we are violating relativity, right? Because relativity talks about the speed of light being the ultimate kind of threshold, so to say. Well, it does not quite violate relativity, because this thing that we are doing here, right, the information is transferring immediately, like without any delay, right? But the way we use that information, which is what we call as physically meaningful information, for that you need to have a way to communicate between the two terminals, right? And if you were to take the net of the net process, right, of the information transfer and the communication, that does not violate relativity, right? So that is the resolution of sorts, right? Now I will take a slightly...
I also heard that mentioning of Man ki gati.
Man ki gati, yes.
Many,
right.
you know,
I know. Man ki gati say, yes. I mean, there is always this aspect of man, when we talk about man, the idea of consciousness or information, right? So I would like to highlight here that even physics does not say that information cannot travel faster than light. Information can travel faster than light, right? But physically meaningful information, right, which can give ideas about the physics aspect of things, right, which relates to that more directly, does not violate relativity per se. So relativity is still safe at the level of physics, right? But information is not just physics, right? Information is in maths, information is in information theory, computation, for instance, and so on and so forth, right? Now, I would like to take a small detour of sorts, right? I mean, a little bit of a variance from what people speak about in popular science talks and so on and so forth when they connect Bharatiya Gyan Parampara and physics, quantum physics in general, right? So one thing about this idea of measurement, right? We say that when we measure something in the quantum domain, it goes from a state of superposition to a localized state, right? However, in Vedanta, right, or in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, for instance, where Pratyabhignya is this idea of recognition, self-recognition, we actually go the other way around, right? If you think about it, right? Because what we are doing here is we have a localized person, us, right? If we were to realize ourselves, right, our own reality, so to say, then we become part of a greater self, so to say, right? A greater with a capital S, self, right? Which is what we talk about in Vedanta, right? If you realize you're Brahman, right, you're no longer an isolated entity. You're no longer an isolated person as such, right? You are part of a greater reality, right? So you see, there is a logical, it's the logical contrast of sorts, right? In the quantum domain, you're talking about going from a state of superposition, of a multiplicity towards a localized bit, right? Whereas I like to see the Vedantin aspect as going from a state of localization towards a state of superposition. The second thing which I would like to highlight, because you talked about entanglement is not quite what we talk about in Vedanta, and I'll tell you why, right? Vedanta talks about spiritual non-separability, right? Vedanta is talking about how we, at the very fundamental layer, are connected at the spiritual level, right? And in a way, our reality also co-defines, right, or is part of that greater reality, right? And we are interconnected in the true sense, right, as we call it. Now, in physics, what we are talking about is not quite connectedness in that sense, right? It is talking more about correlations of properties, right? How the properties are connected to each other, right? So I often hear in public fora, right, and in popular science talks that entanglement means one particle is affecting the other particle, it's influencing the other particle. Not quite, right? Entanglement is prepared, it can be generated, and then when it is taken apart, there is a one-to-one correspondence of the property values, right? So if I do something here on this side, let's say, then it will not affect the other one. So there's something known as local operation. Local operation means I can do a local operation at one of the terminals. It will not affect the entanglement per se or the other particle, right? So that's a misconception, which I would like to kind of clarify here. So science is not talking about that level of interconnectedness. It's just talking about correlations, right? So when we have to be very careful when we talk about superposition, right? The idea of consciousness, the idea of entanglement, right? In both the realms, firstly, it's spiritual and empirical primarily. And in one case, it is the pura ulta, I would say, the pura contrary, the converse, essentially, as I see it. And in this case, I would say it is not quite talking about the same kind of interconnectedness, right? So we have to be very careful. Now, when we talk about entanglement, one other small point I would like to highlight. In Srimad Bhagavad Gita, right, we actually talk about the breaking of entanglements, right? Breaking of the worldly entanglements, right? Now, people often say that is it the same as the other one as well, right? Now, there is a very famous story which is given in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, or a symbolism or a metaphor basically, which is on the Ashwata tree, right? Ashwata tree, which is a very interesting tree. The tree is such that the roots are in the air and the shoots are below the ground. Upside down, right? Now that is because it talks about how the fundamental reality, right, and the way we look into the, what do you call, the material manifestation, right, it is actually not as we perceive it to be, right? And in this process, he talks about how the worldly entanglements have to be removed, have to be minimized, essentially, right? So that is something where science does not go along those lines, of course, right? I mean, in terms of entanglement cessation, right? There's a slight paradox here, right? The paradox, as you rightly put it, it's a singularity that encompasses all the multiplicity. It has in it the multiplicity, right? Whereas in physics, we're talking about the entanglement being generated between system and environment as well, and increasing levels of entanglement in many different kinds of systems, so to say, right? We are not quite talking about a singularity per se, right? In fact, we are talking about moving away from a singularity, right? For instance, the Big Bang, if you were to kind of go with that idea, is talking about how Lemaitre, there was Georges Lemaitre in 1927, I think he gave this idea, and Hubble and others worked on it, that there is a certain singularity, and from there we have things coming out. Penrose later on talked about cyclic cosmology model, that, you know, there is a Big Bang and there's a big crunch, right? It moves from the singularity, goes back, right? But we are still at the stage where we cannot prove that, right? Because it's still expanding, right? So science does not quite do what we are trying to do in Vedanta, for that matter. And I think that's why it's not all the way correct to kind of join the dots. So we have to be very nuanced in our perspective on superposition and entanglement.